Hello everyone, my name's Sasha Powell and it's my role tonight to welcome you to this Froebel Trust webinar. We've had over 600 of you register and I can see that we've already got nearly 300 of you with us. I'm going to talk for a few moments just to give a bit more time for other colleagues to join, but thank you for being here. And for those of you for whom this might be the first time you've attended a Froebel Trust webinar, you're most welcome. We generally have quite a lot of friends who come back to us time after time. And so if this is your first time with us, I hope you'll enjoy the evening. I'm sure you will. And please do take the opportunity, if you haven't already, to have a look around the Froebel Trust website. There's lots and lots of resources available to you. This evening's webinar will have a particular structure to it. I'm your chair for this evening, which means that I'll pop in and out from time to time, but the main event will be Caroline, and so you'll be hearing mostly from her. So following my introduction, I'm going to introduce Caroline, and then she will talk for about half an hour or so. And after that, there'll be some time for question and answer session, a bit of a discussion. It's lovely to see you putting hellos in the chat. That's great. Keep doing that. And we generally have really lively conversations that go on through the chat throughout the evening. If you'd like to ask a question, that would be really welcome. We've got a Q&A button on the screen, and that's where we'd ask you to type your questions, please. So if there's anything you want to ask Caroline, please type your question in the Q&A and not in the chat, because when we've got hundreds of you chatting in the chat, I can't keep up with the questions, sorry. Tonight's webinar is being recorded, so if you know colleagues who've not been able to join and would like to watch it later, or indeed if you want to watch it again later on, come and look at our website in a couple of weeks' time, and in our film and webinar library you'll find a recording, and that will be free to watch, as are all our films from webinars and other events. So now I'm going to stop waffling and introduce Dr. Caroline Gard. It gives me great pleasure to be able to welcome her and to have the opportunity to listen to Caroline tonight. I've known Caroline for many years. She's currently a senior lecturer in early years education and course leader for the BA Early Years top-up courses at Kingston University in London. But she works there many hours, and on top of that, also spends her time where she's been today, working in nurseries and especially with babies. She was formerly a Froebel Trust PhD bursary student at the University of Roehampton, and that's where she completed her doctoral study, which was called Hearing the Voices of Babies in Baby Educator Interactions in Early Childhood Settings. And so I'm sure you'll agree with me that she's brilliantly qualified to not only have written the Froebel Trust's latest guidance for managers and leaders of settings that either have or will have babies. The guidance is called Thinking About Babies, but also eminently qualified to talk to us tonight in this webinar. So I'm going to welcome Caroline. Caroline, I hope you can hear me. We've had some terrible technical glitches a few moments ago. Ah, there she is. Great. Good to see you, Caroline. And welcome.
Thank you very much and welcome. Just checking you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can. I can.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to share the screen because unfortunately we've had some trouble getting Caroline's presentation up on screen. So I'm just going to hope that this will work. Caroline, let me know if it doesn't.
I will do. Thank you. And do let me know if for some reason you can't hear me for anything.
Sure.
Okay.
How's that looking?
That's super. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Okay. Lovely. All right. Thank you so much, Sasha, for that lovely warm welcome. And of course, to the team at the Froebel Trust for their encouragement and support to write this guidance and to facilitate the webinar this evening. Thank you all also to you all in the audience listening to coming along this evening and sparing your time. I welcome any questions and dialogue from you all following the presentation today. Firstly, I just want to say it's been really positive to see the reaction to this guidance. Working with the Trust to develop it over the last couple of months, it's been really important to us to ensure that we inspire an interest and generate a culture of curiosity around babies, and encourage those leading settings and working with very young children to reflect on our current practices to ensure that babies remain central to our early education pedagogies. I'm aware that we have an international audience this evening, so I just wanted to highlight that I will be drawing from my PhD findings, which were generated in settings based in England. Sasha, would you mind just moving on the slide, please? Brilliant, thank you. So why should we prioritise thinking about babies now? Babies have, of course, always been important, but their presence as stakeholders in the context of early childhood settings and indeed in society has had little attention. In England, our government has increased funding streams from September 24 this year to encourage further childcare places for children aged 9 months of age. This has been met with a varying response, with some concerns around access to the places, staff recruitment, and the level of financial funding. Whilst today's session is not to debate these issues, as we'll all have our own views on these, the evening tonight I wanted to position, for whatever our view, that this long overdue spotlight on babies and early education is a positive shift, and it has potential to elevate and expand our dialogues beyond our sector. It is vital that with this increased attention, we prioritise getting it right for babies. They are not an afterthought in this new funding, or indeed any movement in early education. Whilst we prioritise parents and childcare or nursery provision, we need to think about the emotional and physical needs of the babies. Babies have long been enshrined in a cloak of invisibility, so we need to see these increased funding pots here in England and potentially in other countries as well as a potential for change, to realign what is right for babies and to ensure that our pedagogies and culture in early childhood spaces is grounded in current research-based evidence to ensure they flourish in our care. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So here on the slide, I highlight a particular quote that is from Eleanor Goldschmied and Sonia Jackson. We can never remind ourselves too often that a child, particularly a very young and almost totally dependent one, is the only person in the nursery who cannot understand why he is there. This quote is intentionally included in the new guidance, and it's one that I personally always integrate into any training or conversations that I have around babies in daycare. Both Eleanor Goldschmied and Sonia Jackson were passionate Froebelians, and they remind us that babies should always be at the centre of our discussion and formation of any early education cultures. This quote helps to ground our thinking and remind us who early education is actually for. Where there might be frustrations if babies take time to settle, or perhaps when settling in procedures are accelerated to accommodate parental working patterns, at the heart of early years are the children, who did not choose to leave the comfort and safety of home to enter a larger, potentially louder and potentially less consistent environment. We must listen to them, and we have to value their contributions in these spaces and ensure that our environments are sensitive to any developmental tensions that they encounter when they settle into early childhood settings. You can have the next slide, please, Sasha. So we need to make sure that we acknowledge the principles that enshrine Froebelian approaches. Contemporary Froebelian principles frame our thinking around valuing infancy as a distinct period of development. For too long, infancy has been amalgamated into childhood, with no distinct differentiation to support our workforce or funding. Froebel, however, acknowledges that it is a distinct area within childhood, and he positions every child as a unique, autonomous learner who is capable of contributing to their own social world. We as educators and as leaders should value the essence of who they are and advocate for the baby's contributions to be a visible aspect of early childhood culture. To Froebel, we are all connected to each other and to the environments in which we live. Tina Bruce reminds us of the phrase, link, always link, meaning that we need to make visible and be conscious of the interconnectedness that the child finds within themselves and their experiences in the whole world and universe around them. It is these connections that are grounded within our relationships with others, and this foregrounds everything. Relationships matter and have a central importance to a baby's life, both in homes and in early childhood settings. Thus, our culture and pedagogy should start always with connection. We can move on to the next slide, please. So what did Froebel think about babies? Froebel cautions that dismissing a child's communicative attempts devalues a child's identity and their position in society. He reminds us here in this quote to take time to examine how babies interact with others, particularly with those who care for them, and reflect on the responsivity of those caregiving adults. A baby may appear helpless, but his power of thought is much greater than we can ever imagine. Aligning to Froebel's notion of seeking unity in both the internal and external life, I contend that babies share their external expressions into the social spaces, and these are perceived as arising from their inner life. From their inner life, they connect with others in a gradual social unfolding. Development and learning are rooted in social encounters, and it is through these moments where babies are encouraged or discouraged to recognize how they are intrinsically connected to their family and the wider environment, as this ultimately shapes their existence to the world, to be more, and which is sort of specifically studied within my study. The next quote on this particular slide draws from Tina Bruce's work, and she reminds us that the child is connected in all dimensions of life, that they are always seeking relationships and are linked to relationships with others. Babies have agency to shape and influence the environment in which they are situated. Tina Bruce's writing helps us to understand Froebel's thinking in a contemporary world, and here she acknowledges the child's self-awareness emerges through a sustained connection with and linking to learning with others and relationship matters in the universe. Okay, next slide, please, Sasha. So what is it that babies need? There is an abundance of evidence from all research fields that now confirm the irrefutable connection between neurological development and early experiences. I draw specifically here on the Royal Foundation report, as they are spearheading a movement to bring current research and literature to the foreground of everyday thinking, not just in our sector, but across broader society. Those caring for babies and young children are the critical link between healthy development and have a profound impact on a child's future development. Babies need to feel safe and secure. They need to feel love and learn what love looks like in different contexts of their lives. That's not just in the home, but in other spaces they inhabit. When we think about babies, we need to remember that every interaction and every response shapes our relationship with them. This has consequences for their overall development. In addition to knowing more about the interrelation between relationships, environment, and brain development, is the close correlation between the well-being of those who care for the babies. Their well-being and mental health matters, and our ability as individuals or as a collective workforce has an exceptional influence over our ability to form and sustain consistent and responsive interactions with young children. We could just move on to the next slide, please. I was keen this evening to offer a bit of a context around research associated with baby rooms in formal daycare, particularly looking at it from a lens of England. When I refer to formal daycare, I'm thinking of full-time day nurseries, which are typically open from 8 AM to 6:30 PM. So what do we already know about baby room provision? We know that it's a neglected area for research, and often baby rooms are particularly misunderstood and a complex room in the setting to organise. Despite this, figures indicate that over 30% of children around the age of under the age of 2 regularly attend formal daycare in England, with approximately 20% currently involved in nursery settings, with this set to increase in England in response to government funding in September. Several studies over the years have reiterated the significance of relationship formation in day nurseries and its association between the lack of these relationships, and cortisol rises in the brain. Sasha Powell and Kathy Gucci's longitudinal baby room research in England determined that relationships are central to baby room pedagogy, and the effectiveness of baby room practices is entangled with the social and political status of those working with children. This has been echoed by other studies internationally. Other research studies have also drawn attention to the emotional resilience and readiness of educators to work closely with babies. My own study last year has highlighted the amalgamation of organisational responsibility combined with personal anxiety around the personal involvement and attachments with babies. And this paints a complicated picture in nursery provision for early childhood educators. Next slide, please, Sasha. So thinking about my study, and obviously this is what the guidance has been developed from. My PhD study was very kindly and generously funded by the Froebel Trust between 2018 and 2022. The impetus for my study was around my concern regarding the marginalisation and invisibility of babies' own contributions to research, and also the potential lack of visibility in early childhood settings. The purpose of my study, therefore, was to be deliberate in its attempt to draw out baby's voice against the backdrop of a typical baby room in nursery settings. It was an ethnographic study framed within a multi-method methodology, which included visual methods in form of video. And Sasha, if you just click on the next slide, it should come up with a little bit about methodology, if that's okay. So in the interest of time today, I'm not going into too much detail about the methodological approaches, and this can be found in my main thesis and also in my report on the Froebel Trust website. And of course, I'm very happy to talk with others after the dialogue today, if you want to contact me directly. But there were 2 field sites involved. I was out in the field for 6 months in each setting. There were 6 focus babies, all under the age of 1, and their parents were involved, and 7 educators as well were also involved. So I'm going to move on now and talk about the findings with regard to the study, which centred primarily around the babies themselves, because they were the central kind of stakeholder within the study. So on the next slide, if we just start to go through some of the findings, just to help you kind of position and understand why the guidance has been developed in the way that it has. So findings from my study centralised around the babies and their use of voice and the visibility of this voice as a pattern of communication. Voice was used as a strategy to increase presence and position in the environment. The babies worked very hard to enact their voice, to establish themselves as a visible member of the baby room. And the next point highlights that voice was really dialogically kind of threaded within the connections that they have with all the adults in the room. Typically, it was a silent contribution, but this tended to be lost or missed within the sort of the busyness of everyday life. The next slide, point highlights the irregularity and fragmented contact that babies tended to have with special adults. They received very little sustained one-to-one interactions. And when I mean sustained, it's more than just doing the nappy changes or sitting with them for a couple of minutes. It was the real close connected contact. And there was very few of those moments captured within the 6-month period that I was in sort of both the settings. The next point highlights how babies with irregular attendance patterns, the younger the baby as well, so under 6 months of age, or an only child or firstborn, they tended to be more inconsistent with the confidence of voice that they shared in the settings. They also had less time with the educators. Therefore, any relationship that was formed obviously took much longer to establish, but again was often fragmented because of the nature of their attendance patterns. Positively though, the final point on this slide highlights that the baby's confidence in voice, their sharing, their multimodal use of their body really did elevate when in contact with a special adult. So highlighting this close connection with special adults such as key people, that the individual aspects of that, it was very important to highlight that they had to be sustained and repeated encounters. And from those sustained and repeated encounters, the key person and the child were able to develop a history together. So they had rituals that they formed which were familiar to one another when they reconnected later on in the day or later on in the week. So the next slide brings to life Froebel's thoughts around connection and early relationships. My findings very much resonate with the Froebelian stance that encourages the importance of interconnection with others in the wider world. Froebel's quote here on your screen refers to the significance of early relationships with parents who are seen to draw the child out into the social world, giving him or her the tools required to form relationships with others. To the child, the sight of grown-ups around him, and this is very true of his parents, who at first command his whole field of vision, is the sun which draws him out. And when he establishes other relationships within and beyond himself, these are the climatic conditions, the broader sky under which he grows up. To all these impressions and conditions, he is more sensitive than the tenderest plant. I argue in my study that in collaboration with parents, educators take on the role as the sun to draw the child out into early childhood spaces. We must find time to show interest and get to know babies that we care for, and to support them in navigating the choppy waters that occur in nursery environments. So collectively and individually, we need to ask ourselves as a sector, what are the climatic conditions that occur in nursery environments? How do we support the baby to navigate these surroundings? What strategies we have in place, and how do we nurture and value each baby's contributions? As leaders, we need to ask, does our nursery culture contribute to a calming, sensitive and serene landscape where babies feel safe and can take time to form connections and flourish in our care? The next slide takes you towards some of the findings that occurred around the baby room culture. So the focus, of course, of my study was around babies' voices, but it did unearth some very important findings regarding culture of nurseries, not just for babies, but for all children and the workforce. It's from these findings that the guidance has largely been developed that you have accessed. So my findings pointed to a nursery culture dominated, sort of acutely dominated actually, by institutional practices which appeared rooted in government directives and created substantial tensions and ruptures in everyday working practices for the educators and for babies. There's a couple of points just to bring up on the screen now. And when I talk about tensions, I refer to moments of care where babies and educators' attention was often misaligned, which resulted in staff feeling overstretched, or babies either crying, which created more stressful environments, or babies falling silent and becoming lost. There was an acute sense of emotions being overwhelmed for everybody involved, staff, babies, and also at times myself as a researcher. Educators felt pressured to be busy, but they were also compressed within a working culture of conflict, where they were desperately trying to be with the babies to enact playful, responsive acts of care, but were typically pulled away to fulfill other obligations, to spread their attention across several children with differing or competing needs. The nursery cultures that I witnessed in the baby rooms across this study conflicted directly with the Froebelian philosophy of time being freed and the slower pedagogy that Alison Clark has pioneered in recent years. The physical and emotional availability of educators being with babies to connect and learn about them appeared deeply intertwined but compromised by institutionally shaped demands and traditions. Things like we need to get nappies done, or moving furniture to accommodate sleep routines or lunchtimes created ruptures in the moments of connection. Without moments of connectivity with others, or establishing a culture where these moments are embedded, we need to find time for these to be a valued feature of practice across all hierarchies of nursery. Without this, babies are at risk of becoming lost or invisible to educators, and their efforts are stifled by adult-inflicted routines and organisation. As leaders listening this evening, we need to be honest and reflect on our nursery spaces. Are these issues that I talk about familiar to you? What can be done to challenge some of the everyday ruptures of care that might occur? If we just move on to the next slide, please, Sasha. So the guidance that you have intentionally draws out some key domains for leaders to consider in their reflections around developing a baby room culture and supporting staff. The guidance acknowledges the obvious complex challenges associated with working in baby rooms and leading provision for young children. A prominent feature emerging from my study was how the babies were often seen as no different from the older preschool children in terms of planning for learning, planning staff configuration, and everyday practices. The baby room is a difficult room to organise and maintain continuity in. So there's no surprise that in part of my findings, staff consistency was a feature that continually came up in conversation with practitioners. One challenge revolves around adult and child ratios. The quote on the screen comes from a participant of my study. You are trying to be on a one-to-one, and they all just want your attention. You feel like there is not enough of us to give them enough attention. They all just pile over. We're very fortunate in England that our adult to child ratios with children under 2 is currently 1 adult to 3 babies. But even this was a challenge, particularly when there were several babies new to the setting, or the dynamics or staff configuration and children changed each day. If anything, the staff involved in my study cited ratios as a problematic feature of provision. They argued that they did feel overstretched and spent much of their day talking to one another about staff organisation to ensure everybody had breaks and they could manage shift changes. They also said that they felt at times management teams were removed from the realities of being with babies for prolonged periods of time. Although managers were physically present, in form of perhaps popping their heads in to check everyone was okay, staff didn't really feel listened to or emotionally contained themselves. We just move on to the next slide, please, Sasha. So this leads us to think about the competing pressures that arise in the baby room. Staff in my study felt that they oscillated between prioritising practical tasks and prioritising the needs of the children. They felt that the nursery culture itself was not conducive for both aspects to work in unison. They shared that they were mindful that very often this oscillation between tasks and these competing pressures resulted in times where babies' needs were not fully met, and crying was viewed as a usual occurrence in a setting, particularly for babies who were settling in. The quote on the screen highlights some of these issues and sort of the deep-rooted feelings that many of the practitioners had. It just feels like there is a pressure to upkeep the routine, the activities, the cleanliness, the tidiness in the room. It feels like there is always a worry, and there needs to be a pressure about what's coming next and are we going to be ready for it. As a team, it feels like we just can't enjoy them or be with them. It doesn't feel like it is sacred or respected. There is always something else. It's important to note that the practitioners in my study shared they wanted to spend more time with the babies and experienced emotions, deep-rooted emotions for the babies that they cared for. They were incredibly committed to their job and to the children, and they felt a huge accountability towards the babies, particularly those who were with them full-time. They also felt that they were failing the children when they were unable to respond to them in a timely manner and take time to share those unfolding moments of care, as this quote alludes to. And this leads us on to the other dimension that's included in the guidance for us on the next slide, which is thinking about the demands of the job. It became clear in the study that there were many, many demands placed on the educators, but this came at a cost. This cost was their suppressed emotions and their frustrations around staff configurations and those everyday niggles and exhaustion that come from caring for babies and absorbing their emotions. The quote on the screen, "I have done it for such a long time now. You do just learn not to let it get to you, because otherwise the children will start feeling what you're feeling. So it makes it 10 times worse." It's like when we get a new member of staff in, who doesn't know the children very well. You can tell because the children will be all over the place, completely out of sorts. So I just think we just have to put our emotions away. It's just what we're used to. We deal with it every day, so we just do it. There is little recognition of the emotional and exhaustive nature of the demands of working with babies in current policy. So I argue that it's up to leaders of settings to tune into these challenges, to acknowledge and to act on them for the babies, but more pressing for the staff. I would argue it's imperative, even if policy is lagging behind, that we advocate more time to support staff and listen to the demands of the job. In doing so, we can make small changes locally, which in turn may affect the well-being and retention of our own workforce. With these small movements, we can work together as a sector for a bigger movement and for greater impact for babies and for our staff. And this leads us on to the next slide, Sasha, please. So the final aspect of the guidance thinks about training and development. And a key aspect of our statutory guidance in England, and of course the Froebel Trust guidance that you have, is to ensure that we have a workforce working with babies, specially trained with the key skills that they need. Within my study, staff were provided opportunity to access a reflective space to learn more about the babies and the working practices they encountered. Similar to Peter Elfer's work discussion model, the reflections were cyclical, as in they were not a one-off, but revisited and nurtured over several sessions with an individual who was not management. There needs to be sufficient highly trained and knowledgeable educators to respond sensitively to babies' voice contributions and their other care needs. Without a sufficient and consistent workforce, babies' unique contributions are vulnerable to misalignment and are missed altogether. You can see from the quote on the screen that any training and development has the potential to transform thinking and elevate practices for children and for staff. But this has to be regular and revisited with individuals and as a group reflection. Froebel speaks about the importance of reflection and states how reflecting and learning is not an effortless unfolding. It takes time, commitment, and investment. If we can just move on to the next slide, please, Sasha. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk to you about one of the key recommendations that have come out of my work, which is sort of embedded in the guidance for you to take away and think about. A recurrent aspect of the study was this sort of feeling that came through from the educators that they didn't feel they had permission to pause and to slow down and be with the babies. They felt that being with the babies in interactions was not seen by others as hard work. They felt that actually, when they were in those moments, they were typically interrupted. So those caregiving moments were disconnected or ruptured. One of the educators, as you saw in the quotes that I shared earlier, said that actually she felt that these moments were not seen as sacred or respected by management and leaders due to that sort of continual interruption or being asked to do other jobs. So one of my emerging recommendations is to find time to slow down, to create moments of dialogic encounter where the practitioner, educator and the babies are seen as equal together. The educators in my study did sort of seek a stillness. They wanted to be with the children, but organisational tasks have got in the way. I talk a lot about this in my main report, but the work of Debbie Brace and Peter Elfer has alluded that there might be more to play than just the institutional distractions, and maybe it's rooted in the personal anxiety as well. Nevertheless, I envisage that a concept of slowing may give educators the ability to feel they have permission to be at ease with children and deeply connected with them. So the moments that I captured where we were on with the practitioner and the babies were on a one-to-one were very powerful, emotive and deeply welcomed by the baby and the staff members. They materialised in a rhythmic and responsive way, harmonious in quality, where their two worlds came together in unity. They had respect for one another. Within these moments, affectionate touch, eye gaze, anticipation and interconnectedness transpired. Practitioners seemed to empower the babies in these moments, and in turn, the staff were also empowered and moved by spending time with the children in that deeply connected way. These moments needed to be acknowledged and valued at all levels of a nursery organisation. Moments to pause and be with children are an integral feature of effective baby room practice, and this can result in increased self-confidence and a sense of belonging for the babies, but also for the staff members. And if we just move on to the next slide, it might be this is where we need to stop sharing, Sasha, if that's okay, and I then share my screen. If we can do it without everything freezing. Lovely, thank you. Okay, so one of my key recommendations is the concept of Adagio interactions. So I'm just hopefully going to share screen with you now, because we have a video which does not have any sound, so don't panic if you can't hear anything. And I'm just going to ask Sasha or Victoria just to let me know if that has shared screen. Come on,
Yes.
the audio.
Yes,
Super.
that's fine, Caroline.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so the concept of Adagio draws from a musical concept of slowing down and being at ease with another, sort of slowing to a walking pace. And this concept really draws from the idea that we need, or we should be encouraging our workforce to feel that they can slow down and stop and be with babies and all children in slow and mindful connections. So I'm going to show you a bit of a video of the types of interactions that I captured when I was out in the field, which shows you how Adagio interactions can be quite a visible dialogue where voices are interconnected and valued and respected. So hopefully the video will play, but again, there's no sound to this. Okay, right, so hopefully you saw that. Sasha, did that play okay?
Yes, Caroline, it did. Thank you.
Super. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to Sasha to share the next slide, just because there have been a few issues this evening. But as she does that, I will just talk you through a little bit more about Adagio. So Adagio offers educators a concept to feel that they've got permission to pause, and it gives managers and leaders a clear and visible concept to embed within a setting pedagogy to promote relationship forming and slower paced practices, which is developmentally appropriate for babies and indeed all children. And if we could just go to the next slide, if that's possible, Sasha, please. So just this slide gives you a little bit more around sort of the concept of Adagio. It's playing purposefully on Malik and Travassen's term commutative musicality, so the rhythms that we create when we connect with young children, particularly babies. And like I've said, it encourages us to be at ease and to slow our practice down to a walking pace. In the context of early childhood education and care, it allows us to feel we have permission to slow down. It's a concept that I feel could be applied and embedded to established and organic natural practices that occur, but also for settings where things are quite busy and practitioners feel maybe they don't have time to settle. They could, for now or for the time being, plan time for Adagio interactions to help realign relational care and making sure that it becomes a central feature of pedagogy. It allows practitioners and educators to really build a familiar ritual with babies and dilute any adult-centric practices to keep the baby at the core of any planning that we do. Together, the adult and the child are viewed as equal partners. So there's no power dynamics at play. We're mutually answerable to one another, and we listen and we reciprocate in our connection. Okay, and you will find that within Adagio moments, there is an individual rhythm that is captured. So each practitioner and every baby will have a different rhythm and ritual that's formed. And I guess that's the beauty of it. That if we allow time for these interactions to take place, then we can form really deep-rooted relationships with children. If we can just move on to the next few slides, just before I come to an end of these bits. So moving forward, developing a culture for all babies. Babies want and need connection, and that was probably one of the key things that came through in my work, which it sounds really silly to say. I was quite shocked by that, but really it was quite a visceral movement that I saw with the children. They spent all day seeking connection with adults. They always found creative ways for these connections to manifest in movements and communication patterns. The individual one-to-ones were few, but the encounters that did unfold were often fragile and easily ruptured. So this brought about challenges. So it's really important that relational care is at the heart of any culture we establish for babies. It should be responsive and relational in terms of the curriculum that we offer, and we detail that in the guidance. Our curriculums and pedagogies must ensure there is time for uninterrupted play and time to be with each other to get to know one another. Staff continuity and consistency is an absolute must when it comes to all children, but specifically within the baby room. And we are morally and ethically accountable for babies and our decisions that we make as leaders, managers, and as educators. But key to the culture for all babies is the culture for the workforce as well. So the next slide just highlights the importance of having an appropriate culture for babies that's deeply entangled with a responsive culture for the workforce. Institutional culture that's underpinned by policy will often conflict the individual needs of babies and educators. So in order for us to kind of source time to establish slower movements and slower strategies such as Adagio, the workforce need to be held and feel valued themselves. The guidance that we've developed specifically for leaders thinks about generating dialogue around responsive cultures for babies, but also for our workforce. You cannot separate the two. We often talk in early years about our workforce being part of the support network for new parents and for families. But we need to consider the support networks that are available for early years professionals. The complexity of their role and the emotional connections that we expect our workforce to make with children requires reflective spaces. Who offers support to our workforces? What does this look like? And how can it be formalised and made visible and an accepted natural part of our practice? And if we can just have the next slide, please, Sasha, as I come to an end. Thank you. So I've taken this directly from my thesis, actually. It's just my sort of reflections and thoughts as I drew my work to a close. Froebel reminds us in his writing that we are all closely bound in association with everything else in the great chain of being. As a society, whether we are parents, educators, or leaders, we are all morally, ethically, and mutually answerable to babies. We are accountable for any political blind spots that are created in society, but also within our nursery spaces. Whilst the guidance that we provided encourages us to think about babies, we actually need to do more. This is just the start. We need to think about them more, we need to talk about them more, and we need to advocate for them. We need to make sure there's time to be with them and learn alongside children. Froebel himself was a disruptor in the way that he challenged assumptions about children and early education. So I encourage us all today to disrupt the ways in which we think about babies. It is our moral and ethical duty to do the very best for them and to advocate for the best culture for them to thrive and flourish in our care. And then just finally, I bring you back to Froebel's quite powerful quote regarding our moral and ethical kind of responsibility to be baby's son, to draw them out into the worlds in which they join us in, whether that's childminding settings, nursery spaces, or home settings. It's really important that we take this on board as a sector. And I hope that in sort of listening in this evening, we can think about how we value babies' contributions and how we can develop a pedagogy that's right for them. So thank you very much for listening. Just the last couple of slides is just a slide for thank you and acknowledgements before we go to any questions. And the next slide, Sasha. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Sasha. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Caroline. You managed to pack in a huge amount, a lot of which was very complex and absolutely brilliant. I enjoyed your presentation immensely. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
And I encourage everybody to read the guidance that you've written, and also to look at your report on the Froebel Trust website. And if you're keen to read a PhD thesis, absolutely read Caroline's PhD thesis. So, and you've also got an article in the journal Early Years, haven't you, about your research, if I remember correctly?
Yes, I have.
There's quite a bit to read there.
Yeah.
We've got lots of questions, so I'm going to dive straight in the time that we've got remaining. One of the things that really struck me while you were talking that kept coming back to me was this sense of interruption for the babies, efforts to be recognised, heard, valued, listened to, connected with, understood, but also for the educators working in those settings when you talked about this sort of constant demands to be doing other things. So there was very much a sense of a lack of flow, perhaps, is the one way I might describe it. And one of the questions we've had is about, I guess, a sense of flow through physical spaces. In fact, we've had two questions. One is about whether you've come across and what you think about a freedom of movement for babies through different spaces and places within a setting. You know, to what extent are they confined, I suppose, to a space or spaces? And the other question really is about their access to outdoor spaces. So I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit, please.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a sort of a point for us all to reflect on, because every space within nurseries, childminding settings will be very different. And I think it's allowing us to think about how we design those spaces to encourage that flow of movement. We know that from even Piaget's work, that the movement that we have in those first 2 years is absolutely fundamental to our whole being as we grow up. So it's really vital that spaces are not cluttered, that babies are able to physically engage in movement as they maneuver and navigate the setting. One of the things I've sort of going back into the sector sort of since finishing my writing is about sort of, I guess, distribution of staff. And thinking, where are we placing the staff? Very often the disruption and the interruptions come from taking a baby off something they've clambered on, or moving them away from something that might be unsafe. So I think it comes from a lot of thought and design from the outset within the spaces that we create for children, and allowing them time and space within the resources that we're providing. So even if you are restricted inside, but there is spaces for them to safely climb and engage those physical movements. There's spaces for them to be cozy. There's spaces for them to snuggle up with adults, but there's also spaces for them to engage with others, their peers, because actually within baby rooms, it's such a rich environment for those social engagements with each other, which again is another kind of research of interested mind, sort of as they begin to toddle and they begin to interact really cleverly and closely with one another. The outdoor spaces as well. I know sort of a few people listening in this evening from the setting that I'm working in, I often will say, why have we got baby rooms upstairs? I think it needs to be a bigger dialogue, because it's such a challenge sometimes to get babies, by the time they're all dressed and then you take them all downstairs, it takes up a lot of time. And again, it's adult centric time. So we need to think about, if we're outside, and I know the whole Froebelian philosophy is about nurturing ourselves in the outdoors and open spaces. Can we facilitate more time in the garden? So if it takes you so long to get out, let's spend longer outside. Let's think about having lunches outside and snack times outside. And again, that facilitation of all different movements, that freedom of movement into different spaces, whether they're small and cozy or whether they're larger and encourage those sort of broader gross motor skills as well.
Yeah.
I hope I answered some of the questions that came up.
Great. Thank you. It leads me on to actually another question, because you've quite rightly pointed out the importance of thinking about and planning what opportunities, what spaces, what different kinds of spaces and feel of them there is for babies. But one of the questions is about your feelings about whether to scrap adult-initiated planned activities in order to better focus on babies' interests.
Yeah, I think this is a really tricky one, and every setting again will have their own ethos and culture and expectations, and I know that many of the people listening who are based in England are bound by expectations with Ofsted as well. But I think primarily we need to make sure that anything we're providing is responsive and flexible to ensure that the child is at the centre of it. I know we had a bit of dialogue between ourselves as we were creating the guidance to ensure we were getting the wording right, because actually by scrapping this concept of adult-led planning, actually we're then not necessarily thinking about what we're providing. So it's really important that we are planning for babies in terms of resourcing and in terms of spaces, but not necessarily being the person telling them what to do in an activity. We're there as a companion, learn alongside them. And I go back to Eleanor Goldschmidt's work of treasure baskets, and she was absolutely adamant that the treasure baskets are there for the children to investigate independently, and we are there to watch, to smile, to encourage, and to be there to extend thinking or learning as and when that's required. So I think there is an element of planning that absolutely needs to be there, but it's the adult directed planning in the moment that actually we can take a step back from and just see how the children engage in the environment to move things forward.
Yeah, definitely. I'm wondering whether it takes me back to something that you said right at the beginning of your presentation, which was about encouraging a culture of curiosity around babies, as well as talking about their invisibility. And I don't know, how does that happen? How do you encourage a culture of curiosity around babies, both within a baby room, within the setting as a whole, in a university, with policymakers, in the society at large? How does that happen, do you think? What sorts of things can we do to be advocates?
I think fundamentally it's thinking about the dialogue that we have, not just within the sector in our little silos, but actually collectively. It's about education, and I think certainly the Royal Foundation are pushing a lot in terms of getting out the importance of the early years. The 1001 Critical Days movement in England has been really important. So I think it's educating, it's ensuring that we have the right knowledge. So sharing conversations, attending things like webinars like this, and having dialogue across organisations to really acknowledge the fact that babies have so much to tell us. Froebel always talked about that they have so much to tell us in their movements and communications. That we need the workforce to take a step back really, and to maybe make sure that within your plan or your staff continuity and configuration, that staff have time to watch. Just literally to take a step back and to watch babies and to learn from them. And from that, I think within small cultures, within nursery spaces, we can generate a curiosity. Why is he or she doing that? What could they be telling me? That's really interesting that he throws these objects. Why might that be? Why are they spending more time with this person and not that person? What is that person offering the child? And I think it is trying to generate that interest and that curiosity, but ensuring that the workforce feel listened to as well, and that they have spaces to reflect. And that's again one of the big things I found going back into working in settings. It's an amazing experience and it's wonderful, but where is the time for the staff members to really reflect and have a dialogue together? And I think that's a priority. Yeah.
It seems to me that's part of the slowing down that you've talked about, really. It's the opportunity to and space to reflect. I suppose I wanted to ask you really about whether initial education and training, continued professional development, support, mentoring, and the nature of that. Somebody's question was about your views on the proposals for an experience-based learning route and the consultation that there is at the moment. What kinds of changes might we need to ensure that people who want to work with babies and those who are working with babies will have access to the sorts of education, training, support, inspiration and mentoring that will enable all of us to sustain that culture of curiosity about and around babies?
I think there's so many different strands to this and this potential dialogue that we can have. Oh, is there someone talking? No. It's about the fact, I think fundamentally what we need to consider is ensuring that the bigger conversation around babies and the importance of early years, the 0 to 2, 0 to 5 period, is out there within society. That we recognise, that parents recognise the fundamental role that early years practitioners and educators fulfil, and the government are seeing that, and there needs to be that policy change, because without that, this organisation, this culture of conflict that's come through in my work, and I'm sure is coming through in other people's studies as well, we need to find the time for reflection, and we need to find time to ensure that the education that we're providing our workforce is rich and is underpinned by evidence-based research as well. So we can't do that without adequate funding, and we can't do that without a sort of a team, a sort of a bigger team, sort of in terms of governments and organisations that really believe that this is how the workforce should be trained and moving forward. I do think there's value in I guess, working on the job, so to speak, and learning whilst you're there, providing you've got a very skilled and tuned in mentor that can support you, and you do have additional reflection time with people who are skilled for you to kind of unpack all the things that you might be coming across. But I think it's a bigger dialogue, I suppose, outside of today's webinar, to really think about collectively as a sector and beyond that, and internationally as well. Kind of let's look at our partners. How does it work in other countries? How have other people overcome these issues that we are certainly facing here in England, but I know Wales, Scotland and beyond are also facing them as well.
Yeah, indeed. I suppose perhaps we think of it in lots of different ripples that are all connecting, starting with ourselves and on a small scale, and hopefully rippling outwards to a much grander scale. This seems a very obvious question, and it probably differs in different contexts in different countries, but someone has asked, what do you mean by babies? What ages are you talking about? You said in your study the babies were all up to 1. Do you want to just talk a little bit about baby rooms and also the relevance of your guidance to different ages?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, like I said, my study focused on primarily kind of recruiting, it's an awful word, but recruiting babies who were under 1, because I was really keen to ensure that they had a voice within the work that I did, because I really feel that they are the silent kind of cohort, I guess, of a nursery provision and in early education as well. So babies for my study was under 1. When we think about babies in early education in England, our ratios are under 2s, so it's 0 to 2. So often we will refer to that, and obviously I spoke for the ratios within the presentation as well. And I guess also in England we refer to infancy, but we also have the confusion of an infant school, which starts from five years and upwards. But specifically for the context of the guidance that we've provided, it's thinking about babies. And I really believe that actually the guidance works for under 2. So it's babies specifically, but actually a lot of the learning, thinking about the culture for the workforce, the emotional dimensions, particularly when you're working with 2-year-olds as well, it does affect sort of up to that age group. But again, we encourage leaders and managers to look at the guidance specifically thinking about their baby room context. And I know in England with day nursery specifically, a lot of baby rooms will be 0 to 18 months. We want to kind of accommodate the kind of complexities that occur working with very young children.
Absolutely, yes, thank you. We're nearly out of time. So I'm just going to ask you, Caroline, about do you think in September in England, when the funding for babies aged 9 months and up comes in for so-called free hours of early education, things will change and there will be more of a lens on what's happening in babies' lives in baby rooms? Do you think that having this investment from government will cause a change, a shift in focus?
I'm hopeful. I am ever hopeful that things will change. I wonder if we will be a little bit behind the change. So I think what will happen is obviously the funding's coming in September, and I think it's going to take 6 months or so for that realization, maybe up that kind of hierarchy, that things maybe are not quite ready for the amount of babies we're about to receive. And I know that for some settings locally to me, there's waiting lists already through the roof. I think crucially, we absolutely have to disrupt. We have to talk about it. We have to say, and we need to prioritise as a sector and beyond the sector that the funding is there. And unfortunately, my belief is that it's being pushed on parents to really centralise parents and their working patterns rather than centralising the babies. So as a sector, I'm really encouraging us all to come together and say the babies are at the core of this. Go back to that Eleanor Goldschmidt quote. They don't know why they're suddenly plonked into nursery or childminding settings. So we have to advocate for them and talk on their behalf. And then hopefully there will be change. I'm hopeful that we need to work together on it.
Yeah, and let's hope it's changed for the better and not for the worse.
Yes, absolutely. Which again, we need to keep talking about it. Yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah.
But the quote is an absolutely beautiful one, and it's so perfect, really, to hold at the fronts of our minds, isn't it? So, Caroline, we've just ticked over to 8 o'clock when we must end. So I want to give you a huge thank you very much indeed for presenting tonight. I encourage everyone again to have a look at your guidance and all your other publications. And just to say thanks to everyone for joining us today, and come back and see the recording in a fortnight if you'd like to review this evening's webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sasha.
Bye.